Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, the 25th of October, 2023, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your hosts today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to have Debi Evans with us, plus a guest.
We're going to get started with Andrew Bridgen. Yesterday, he was in the House of Commons and under the 10-minute rule, he was launching his parliamentary sovereignty (referendums) bill. So let's just listen, first of all, to a couple of minutes of what he had to say.
To move that leave be given to bring in a bill to prohibit ministers of the Crown from making or implementing any legal instrument which is not consistent with the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament unless it has been approved by a referendum and for connected purposes. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, to even contemplate giving away these sort of powers to this sort of body, which affects not just the democratic rights, but indeed the human rights of every single man, woman and child in our nation, without a referendum would be quite simply catastrophic. People have said this will lead to one world government. Well, in fact, it's rather worse. It would be a one world dictatorship. Signing up to this treaty and binding ourselves with the WHO without a single debate on it, a single vote on it, or asking the general public what they think, would make being a member of the European Union look like a democratic paradise by comparison. That's why we need this bill. And I'm aware, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the looming prospect of prorogation, even if the House supports my motion today, the bill will fall in a few days' time. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the phrase goes, I will be back. I will be back.
Okay, so he's referring, so the bill was agreed to, so it had its first reading yesterday. It has a second reading on the 24th of November, which is a Friday, of course. But he's highlighting the point that Parliament is coming towards its end, and therefore it's practically certain that this bill will not pass or could even get to the point of a vote before this Parliament ends and we're into a general election. So, but he's saying he will be back. So he has launched a website. If we just bring that on screen, Save Our Sovereignty. And if you have a look for that, you can keep track of how this bill is going. And of course, he's talking about the international, the health treaty with the World Health Organization, international health regulations, and so on. And there's also a petition and the UK's membership of the World Health Organization. It currently has 8,590 signatures. So clearly we suggest people sign.
As quickly as
complaints that go into the BBC and to Ofcom, the harder it is for them to ignore. And at the end of the day, we need some kind of statement. So Debi, I don't know if you've got any final thoughts on this?
Well, my final thoughts are, I've written about it in my blog this week. I'm absolutely appalled at the total disregard of the majority of MPs. I would like to thank, though, Danny Kruger, MP, and Philip Davis, MP, for actually supporting Andrew Bridgen, but it's an absolute utter disgrace. And as Alex said, Rishi Sunak didn't like the noise, so they were told to quieten down. It's appalling, simply appalling.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Can I just add in there, I'd also encourage people to, if they really support Andrew Bridgen, to thank him for what he did, because of course hundreds, thousands of letters coming into Andrew Bridgen, he can show those to other MPs and show the amount of public support out there. So there's tackling the system, that's a good idea. There's also showing support for Andrew Bridgen. But interestingly enough, we never get very far away from the UK's special propaganda machine, the BBC. The Ukraine war virtually disappeared. The reason is, of course, that it's now becoming ever more apparent that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, with horrific casualties, and now the Russians are starting to advance in key areas. I'm just going to put one little video clip up on screen, which should run. And what you're going to see here is some tanks or armoured vehicles. They're moving at the centre of the screen from right to left. And a huge explosion, and that is the end of life for probably 4 or 5 men, or possibly a lot more if they were armoured personnel carriers. So the death and destruction goes on, supported and made possible, of course, by the ammunition, the munitions poured in by particularly the United States, but also the UK, the EU, NATO, and what is really happening on the ground. Ukrainians in particular slaughtered, Russians dying in a proxy war which is designed to expand the Western power base. But the BBC's got very squeamish because, of course, it's not going as they expected. And so the Ukraine suffering, or the suffering of Ukrainians, is now drifting out of the BBC's sphere of interest. Well, let's move from that on to Gaza. And this headline, again, from the BBC, I just thought was breathtaking. If we can bring that one up. Here we are. So it says live, this was from earlier this morning, Gaza hospitals stopping some services as UN warns fuel runs out tonight. This was such a dismissive headline. It could have been talking about problems in the NHS, that they've had to park some ambulances because they've run out of fuel. They haven't got enough people to make those things. Gaza hospitals stopping some services as UN warns fuel runs out tonight. So my comment on this was, never mind the bombing, for some inexplicable reason, which the BBC can't understand, the Gaza hospitals have run out of fuel. I think this is a really offensive headline, not only for people in Gaza, but anybody in a war zone where the BBC is so utterly dismissive of their suffering. Let's just have a look at a few little clips of what's been happening in Gaza. And as we do this, I recognise that, of course, the suffering has also impacted on Israel. But let's look at these clips of civilian areas in Gaza.
Sorry.
Are we okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
Well, it's pretty clear what's happening there, which is massive bombing of largely civilian areas. And of course, the death and destruction of families and children follows. But let's look at what happens when those bombs hit the ground. So that's the reality of it. Huge explosions, massive buildings dropping to the ground, of course, killing everybody in them and anybody caught in the falling debris. That is the reality of the massive attacks that are taking place in Gaza. And what's the result of the destruction of those buildings? Well, of course, it's casualties. Well, it's very harrowing. We're not going to show too much of those scenes, but that is the reality of what's on the ground, of course, with the full support of the UK Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak, with the support of the Americans, and Biden, with the support of the European Union. Nobody calling for the violence to stop, simply that Israel has its right to defend itself, and Israel chooses to defend itself at the moment by a massive expansion in violence against many civilian targets. And if we bring on this picture, it was part of a video, but I'm just going to use it still. We've got a little...
Sorry, Brian, sorry. I'm completely making a mess of this today.
No, it's okay. That's fine. A little girl who was pitifully crying out for her mother and her family. And I've just put some caption on there. Does it matter at the end of the day where these children are, whether they're in Gaza or whether they're in Israel? They are dying because politicians in UK, in the United States and the EU simply will not put a stop to the violence, which they could do overnight if they reined in the Israeli attacks. Now, let's have a look at the reality, or la-la land, I'm calling it, of politics in UK. And I'm focusing here on Keir Starmer and another BBC article. It said in an interview with LBC on the 11th of October, Sir Keir was asked whether it was appropriate for Israel to cut off the supply of power and water to Gaza as part of a siege of the territory. He said, I think that Israel does have that right. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself. It went on, the article went on Sunday, amid criticism over the comments, Sir Keir visited the South Wales Islamic Centre in Cardiff and met congregants and leaders from the Muslim community. And then he said this, well, it's commenting on what he later said. In a statement later posted to X, formerly Twitter, he said he'd been deeply moved to meet people at the centre and to hear their pain and horror at the suffering of civilians in Gaza. I made clear it is not and has never been my view that Israel had the right to cut off water, food, fuel or medicines. International law must be followed. Now, I've said Keir Starmer's from La La Land. Well, of course, he doesn't support Parliament. He said publicly he supports Davos. But what the man is demonstrating is that he's holding two opposing views simultaneously, which is a classic sign of mental instability. So we've got the breakdown of the thought processes of politicians because they cannot deal with the reality, the common sense position, and what the forced political line is, which is clearly to support Israel at all costs. Let's have a look at the little clip, which I did show a couple of days ago, but we'll put it up again, of Ursula von der Leyen talking about those nasty Russians.
Yesterday, we saw again Russia's targeted attacks against civilian infrastructure, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure with a clear aim to cut off men, women, children of water, electricity and heating. With the winter coming, these are acts of pure terror, and we have to call it as such. Yesterday, we saw again Russia's
Well, there we are, a classic piece of footage, juxtaposition. Von der Leyen, of course, accusing the Russians of terrorism by virtue of her claims that they're bombing civilian areas, they're cutting off power, they're cutting off water infrastructure, and underneath, the social media blogger has put film footage of exactly what Israel is doing to people in Gaza, but von der Leyen stays supporting that Israeli policy, whatever. There has been some backlash, however, so if we have a look at this Politico article, it says that von der Leyen doubles down on pro-Israel stance and lashes out at Iran. But this has produced a backlash because some 800 EU staff took the unusual step of writing to her at the end of last week to protest against what they see as unjustifiable bias towards Israel in the Israel-Hamas war. The protest came after the president neglected to mention the EU support for Palestinian statehood in a speech on Thursday in Washington, despite a two-state solution being a core part of the position of European countries. So there's nothing fair, there's nothing common sense about what this woman is doing. She is simply going to stick to the pro-Israeli line, whatever. But luckily, there is some backlash. Let's just end really with this little clip of the BBC reporting and how they have carefully selected their language when they're talking about casualties.
Including 61 children, have died in Gaza. 12 people, including 2 children, have been killed in Israel. Those figures come from officials.
Well, it's pretty easy, that one, that if you're a child in Gaza, you just die. You just die. But if it's a child in Israel, then you are killed. And clearly the BBC has carefully chosen that language to influence the view and opinion of people watching the BBC propaganda.
So the BBC has been criticised both by Alex Kelly this morning and by Brian. And so let's bring NewsGuard on screen, because NewsGuard, as we have reported before, is part of the disinformation industrial complex. It's all about making sure that anybody is providing transparent, or that they claim they're providing transparent, accountable trust ratings for thousands of news outlets. And of course, they have decided to renew for a further year the trust rating for the UK column. And well, I'm delighted to say that they have given us a trust rating of 27.5 out of 100. And they say that we should proceed, that anybody watching the UK column or reading content on our website should proceed with maximum caution, because the UK column website is unreliable because it severely violates basic journalistic standards. Well, I'm going to say, if the basic journalistic standards that NewsGuard is talking about are those represented by the BBC, then I'm happy and delighted to be violating those basic journalistic standards. So let's look at the specific allegations against us. They say that we do repeatedly publish false or egregiously misleading content. They say that we do not gather and present information responsibly. They say that we don't regularly correct or clarify errors. They say that we do not handle the difference between news and opinion responsibly. And the other one that they are really having a go at us on is that we do not disclose ownership and financing. And of course, that is particularly untrue. Well, they're all untrue, but that one is untrue, because we have said many, many times, and we have said on the website, that we are funded by you, our members, and that is our only source of funding. Now, they are very pleased that we avoid deceptive headlines. They are pleased that we do reveal who's in charge, and that we do reveal any possible conflicts of interest. And they're happy that the site names, that's UK column names, content creators along with either contact or biographical information. But if you want to know more about NewsGuard, do go and have a look at the censored page on the UK column website, which takes you through a timeline of how this disinformation industrial complex has built itself. And you'll find that at ukcolumn.org/censored. So then let's have a look at this. This is the European Data Protection Supervisor meeting, which has just taken place. Thank you to all the speakers and the audience for taking part in the seminar that they have held on child sexual abuse material proposal. So this is the EU's proposal on how to deal with child sexual abuse material. And the proposal is basically that platforms that are providing online chat services, for example, any encrypted services, would be required to scan for child sexual abuse material as it's being uploaded, and therefore breaking end-to-end encryption and so on. Now, this is something which was absolutely universally at this event, or at least significantly universally, derided as being anti-democratic and pretty horrendous. So let's just bring the supervisor of the European Data Protection Supervisor, the main man, on screen. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. Basically saying that the EU's proposals could bring consequences that go well beyond concerns with the protection of children. This is by far the feeling of people that are involved in privacy issues, many legislators as well, and certainly the people taking part in this particular event. And just to remind you of the Index for Censorship comments on the online safety bill, which, by the way, Debbie reminded me before the news programme, receives royal assent tomorrow. So thank you, Debbie, for reminding me of that. But just remind ourselves what they were saying, the Index for Censorship were saying about the Online Safety Act as it will be tomorrow. The provisions in the Act that would enable state-backed surveillance of private communications contain some of the broadest and most powerful surveillance powers ever proposed by a Western democracy. It means that the UK would be one of the first democracies to place a de facto ban on end-to-end encryption for private messaging apps. And the British government 100% using the issue of child sexual abuse material, which they haven't really cared about at any point, as far as I'm aware, in the past. It's suddenly become an issue because it's a great way to front up the argument that we should be preventing people using encrypted messaging apps and so on. Now, a couple of years back, Apple attempted to implement a scanning mechanism for child sexual abuse material on iCloud, which is their cloud storage platform. And that got such a huge backlash from their users that they were forced to absolutely abandon this idea completely. So this was a report from September the 1st, 2023, talking about the fact that they had abandoned their plan to detect child sexual abuse material in iCloud photos. But this, the dropping of this idea happened quite some time ago. My point here is the backlash to Apple's decision to attempt to implement this type of scanning was such that they could not proceed with it. And we need the same type of backlash for legislators, not only in the UK, but across Europe and the world. This is not about protecting children, which we can absolutely show governments across the world have not been attempting to do in any way up to this point.
Yeah, and I'll just add that to that, Mike, that of course it was only a couple of years ago that we had the ICSA inquiry running into a massive supposed inquiry into child abuse in the UK. But at the end of the day, the documentary reports came out, but what actual action was taken on the ground? A few prosecutions of pretty elderly people from their crimes in the past, and otherwise things carry on as normal, including the state stealing children through the secret family courts. All of that still goes on completely unchanged.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column's doing, you would like to support us, please join us. You can do that at community.ukcolumn.org. Your membership helps us immensely. As we said a few minutes ago, this is the only way we are funded, and without your support, we can't do what we're doing. So thank you to everybody that's supporting us at the moment, but please join us if you can. You could pick something up, including the new MHRA Not Fit for Purpose t-shirt, which for anybody waiting, they are on their way. They'll be here very, very soon, and they'll be posted out. They're still available for pre-order, and that's at shop.ukcolumn.org. But please do share anything you find on the various platforms, especially ukcolumn.org and ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. And Debbie, your latest blog is up.
It is indeed, and as I discussed earlier, Andrew Bridgen and Maria Caulfield are on my radar. My message to MPs as well. And why are Switzerland, the Swiss government, sending iodine tablets to 5 million of their population? And why could the Gaza Strip be the city of the future? Two interesting conversation pieces, I think.
Okay, thank you. Debbie, let's move on to health issues.
Yeah, let's. So I've been very fortunate in following a friend and UK column viewer, her journey in the NHS. And I just want to define what is data, because as we've heard from Ben Rubin many times, data is very important in the NHS. And we've got platforms and companies like Palantir involved who are attached to the CIA. So data is the factual information, such as measurements or statistics, used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation. And then we look at data mining. What is the definition of data mining? So according to Merriam-Webster, the data mining is the practice of searching through large amounts of computerized data to find useful patterns or trends. Well, that's very interesting, because what I want to find out is what is going on in the NHS to possibly many people that are watching now. And this is probably news that some people may have heard of and some people may not even know that's going on. So the Royal Cornwall Hospital Trust sent my friend a letter, and on the letter it says, for an appointment, you will be contacted by Ultramed, an online pre-assessment to complete a questionnaire prior to attending for your investigation. Please note, if you fail to complete, this may result in your procedure being delayed or cancelled. You will be required to answer questions about you, your health, and your procedure. So it's like, really, who are Ultramed, and do we have a choice? is there a choice, or have we got to fill in this questionnaire? So I went to have a look at the company, Ultramed. And what Ultramed say is that they work with healthcare professionals to deliver cost and time-effective solutions for pre-operative and pre-procedural assessments. Our person-centered approach ensures we offer products that work not only for the healthcare provider, but for patients too. So what are the benefits then of using a company like Ultramed? Well, it's interesting because the benefits, of course, aren't to us at all. They are to the NHS long-term plans. So the key benefits of Ultramed is that it facilitates the long-term plan. This is to reduce F2F, means face-to-face, to reduce face-to-face outpatients consultants by a third. Also saves clinicians time because it's you that's going to be entering the data, which means that the clinician doesn't have to. So you're going to be doing the work. It also means that your test results are going to be available apparently before a remote face-to-face consultation. And let's not forget the carbon reduction, of course, because people won't need to travel. All they'll need to do is input their data, and there's no upfront capital cost. So clearly you can see that there are plenty of benefits for Ultramed.
Right, sorry, Debbie, just before we move on for that, I just wanted to look at the last one. So procurement is from G-Cloud 12. So we're looking at Google Cloud. This is where this data is being stored.
Oh, we'll come on to that again in a minute. Yes, we can see exactly where the data is being stored. It gets even murkier. But who are Ultramed working with is what I wanted to know next. And there's a whole array of NHS trusts that they're working with. Is yours one of them? But having said that, as we'll come on to in a minute, you don't actually have to be in that NHS trust to get an invitation for Ultramed. But we'll look at that in a minute. But Ultramed have been receiving awards as well. And on the 27th of June this year, King Charles awarded Ultramed the King's Award for Enterprise in Innovation. And Paul, who's the CEO of the company, we'll come back to Paul in a minute, he had a great time receiving this award. So let's look a little bit deeper at Ultramed, because they're also, you'll see a couple of things that you recognise in the next screenshot. You'll see that they're funded by Innovate UK, which is a technically funded from the government for innovations for the UK, all part of the life sciences agenda. And there you can see, I had to highlight it in yellow, is the MHRA. So I can assume from this that the data that you input gets sent to the MHRA, of course, like the CPRD, the website, the CPRD, register that goes to GPs. So we've got a lot of involvement with the MHRA. But who's Paul? Who was the Paul that had a great time when he went to get the award? So Paul is Dr. Paul Upton. He's the co-founder, along with Alan Sanders, who's the creative design director. But Dr. Paul Upton is actually a consultant anaesthetist. And he was at the Royal Cornwall Hospital Trust. He's also been in a few working groups of NICE. But he actually started this organisation back in 2014. But it all started in Cornwall, and their headquarters are based in Penryn, down here. But they're not just in the pre-operative business, which we'll see in a minute. They're also in outpatients. So if you want an outpatient's appointment, or you're waiting for an outpatient's appointment, it could be that you receive a text asking you to access a link which will take you to Ultramed, where you have to enter all of your details for your outpatient's appointments. This covers all sorts of outpatient appointments. As you'll see in the next slide, we've got breast surgery, ophthalmics, urology, lower gastrointestinal, upper gastrointestinal, gynae, rheumatology, you name it, you've got it in there too. And then also when we go to the pre-op, because don't forget they do pre-op as well, and we look at what they're looking at in the pre-operative assessment. So they'll send you a text to ask you to fill in a whole questionnaire. We're looking at, they've got a kids They've also got one for cardiac catheterizations and cardiac investigations, endoscopies, so colonoscopies, gastroscopies, sigmoidoscopies, etc. And IR that stands for interventional radiology services. So do you have to fill in this questionnaire? And actually, when you go into the website and start looking at their privacy agreement, you can see that it clearly says, if you decide to register with us and one of our software products. So actually, you don't have to fill in this questionnaire at all. However, if we go on and go further into their privacy policy, you can see the disclosure of information. And actually, if you do decide to register with them, then you can be sure that your personal information is going to be made available to all sorts of people. Their subsidiaries is what they call them. So you're talking business partners, suppliers, subcontractors. In fact, they can pretty much disclose your information with anybody they want. But where is this information stored? And as Mike rightly said, we were looking at Google earlier, but where they're storing it, they say that it has to be transferred to outside the European Economic Area, the EEA. And this is due to our hosting site, Squarespace, being outside of this area. We always ensure your data is only transferred in full accordance with UK data protection laws. By submitting your personal data, you agree to this transfer, storing, or processing. We will take all steps reasonably necessary to ensure that your data is treated securely and in accordance with this policy. Now, Squarespace, I can tell you now, is based in the USA. In fact, its headquarters are in New York, and it was funded by a £30,000 grant by a guy called Anthony Casalina. And he founded this ages ago. So it's been one of these up and coming new innovative companies. But basically, your data will be stored in New York. So if you want to find out more, you can go through their website and look at the preoperative questionnaire that they ask you to fill in. And you'll see there that they've also been endorsed by the Association of Anaesthetists. So pre-op, but I would encourage everybody actually to go into the website. But I've been looking very closely at how my friend has been dealt with Ultramed. And when she went to her initial appointment, her outpatient's appointment, of which she'd had to register online, which she didn't like doing, as soon as she'd had her appointment, she was red alerted for an invasive procedure. She thought she'd get a letter. But no, literally within hours of leaving the appointment, she got bombarded by texts, and she very kindly allowed me to screenshot the texts, and she was getting them on a daily basis until I said to her, why don't you phone the hospital and say that you don't agree to signing up to the privacy policy of Ultramed? There has to be an alternative. They have to offer you an alternative. And when she did phone the hospital actually agreed with her and said, no, we agree. We wouldn't want to sign that privacy policy either. And we wouldn't want to answer very, very intimate questions. And the questionnaire is quite detailed. So she did get an appointment by refusing to go on to Ultramed, by refusing to decide to register with them, and by insisting that the hospital gave her another alternative. So this is a choice, so you're not forced into doing this. However, my great thanks to Stefan, one of our viewers, who, after I hinted about Ultramed last week on Extra, wrote this email to me to say that his partner had also been bombarded by Ultramed. Now, his partner's in Devon, and Devon isn't actually one of the NHS trusts that Ultramed say they're working with. So clearly, the information is going between trusts, and Ultramed are getting their tentacles pretty much everywhere. And very sadly, Stefan's partner has declined to fill it in and seems to have dropped off the radar. And this is what I'm worried about, is that many people are saying they don't want to fill it in, quite rightly. And I'm saying don't fill it in, just say no, because there is an alternative. There really is, but you must contact your hospital and say that you don't agree to signing up to any of these privacy agreements with any of these companies. Just say no.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. And just sticking with health.
And of course, people in Israel have suffered adverse effects as they have in UK and worldwide. But let's come in on this Haaretz article. And the headline really says it all. Again, Israel is choosing death. Now, I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs. And what we're really seeing, we're seeing that Israelis are being subjected to psychological pressure as a result of what's coming through on news programs. So it starts off here. The massacre in the Gaza border communities is the new formative ethos of Israeli society. It's a perfect and horrifying welding of the Holocaust and the horrors of the Nazis to Hamas and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. According to the new ethos, the slaughterers are not Hamas members alone, but all of Palestinian society in Gaza and in the Palestinian Authority. From now on, all the Palestinians are Nazis, marked for death, to be conquered, expelled, killed. Since the massacre of 1,400 people on October the 7th in a string of border communities, Israelis who are holed up in their homes awaiting the next phase of the war are gathering in front of 4 TV channels which are constantly broadcasting testimony from the massacre and the abduction of the hostages. Israeli society is stuffing itself with an assembly line of stories of bereavement. They are considered good for morale. The wait is being prolonged, the ground attack is being delayed, and the stories continue to flow. And it goes on. They don't help pass the time, they become time itself. They reinforce the basic deep Israeli narrative. Jews are the innocent victims of horrifying Nazi murderousness. There's a huge number of stories which are shaping a collective consciousness. Israeli citizens are undergoing a shift in consciousness now. They're turning into an enlisted society, a nation that's an army, a nation of heroes, a united nation as one together. And finally, it points a finger at Netanyahu. We're led by a man who, even before the massacre, managed to cause the country more damage than it has ever experienced, an architect of the inferno. This is the man who Israel is following, as usual, with typical obedience, while sacrificing the hostages to the rhythm of the drums of war. The Holocaust logic, Israel is once again choosing death. And Israeli death is always the most justified and unavoidable death of all. There's a lot to reflect on in this article because it's showing the intense pressure that the Israeli population are under. Now let's jump from that to the subject of Unit 8200, which is the Israeli intelligence unit that I've warned about for years. And I'm going to come back on once again for anybody that hasn't seen this diagram. We're showing that Francis Maude, as part of the Conservative government in March 2014, set up a memorandum of understanding on what was called digital government. But of course, it linked digital government not only with universities, but also Israeli Defense Force Unit 8200, which you can see top left. And if we add a bit more, we've just chosen one company, but many companies dealing with data, startup and large data, internet data, have got people serving who originally came from Israeli Unit 8200, which is essentially Israeli military intelligence. And if I just highlight, of course, that's the same unit that we showed in the first diagram. And we asked the question, when did the British public ever agree to Israeli military surveillance of our private lives? Now, I'm going to say a very big thank you to somebody who pointed me at a clip. I've taken a small excerpt from it, but let's have a look at this Vice report on Israeli Intelligence Unit 8200. A really comprehensive little documentary. Encourage people to go and watch it, but we're getting the background that if we're dealing with Unit 8200, we are dealing with deep state Israeli military intelligence, which the Conservatives under David Cameron, Francis Maude, have locked in against universities in UK, but also against our own security services. So we can ask the key question, has it been the Israeli Unit 8200 which helped set up and train our 77 Brigade? And to my mind, the chances are very high that that has indeed happened. But did the UK population ever agree to this partnership? And did we ever agree to data being shared? Because there is no question that data is being shared. What happens with it? What sort of data might be shared, and what happens with data that these Israeli units get hold of? Let's look at the second clip. Well, there you have it. Very simply, the data is collected not just on people who are regarded as potential terrorist threats, but anybody around them. And what is that data used for? It's used for control by blackmail. So we can ask a question, is data that's coming from the West freely passing through to the Israeli security organizations? Does that allow them to use blackmail on people based in the West in order to get Western people, for example, politicians, to do the bidding of the Israeli government? Many, many questions to be asked. But of course, remember the key fact that at no stage was the UK public consulted on whether they wanted a partnership with this very, very devious Israeli intelligence system. And I think many people should be questioning their MPs on this arrangement, particularly against the background of friends of Israel through both the Conservative and the Labour parties. I'll leave it to our audience to decide.
Okay, we're just going to end with China and the expansion of war to China. Certainly something that our intelligence agencies seem to be very keen to do, and our governments. Last week I was talking about this meeting in California at Stanford University with the Five Eyes, heads of the Five Eyes intelligence agencies here from the US, UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And they were talking about China basically hoovering up all the Western technologies and so on. That was followed up. That meeting was then followed up with Christopher Wray, the FBI director, speaking 60 Minutes with Scott Pelley. And Pelley was calling China the greatest espionage threat democracy has ever faced. And Wray said, the People's Republic of China represents the defining threat of this generation, this era. There's no country that presents a broader, more comprehensive threat to our ideas, our innovation, our economic security, and ultimately our national security. And I just want you to think about those words in the context of what I was reporting on Monday's program and on Friday's program about China and the Belt and Road Initiative and so on, and the language coming out of China. Pelley then said to him, but all countries spy. This time it was the Australian intelligence head, Mike Burgess, who was replying, and he said, yes, absolutely, all countries spy, our countries spy, but the behavior we're talking about here goes well beyond our traditional espionage. The scale of theft is unprecedented in human history, and that's why we're calling it out. So that's what they're claiming about China. In the meantime, then, Britain, if we come back to Britain, has been very proud to announce that the new Protector drone, this replaces the Reaper drone, has been, the first one has arrived in the UK. I believe there are going to be 19 of them. This is going to go to a re-stood up Squadron 31 squadron, which has been reformed to host these. So these are going to be flying around the world, controlled from 31 Squadron in the UK. So Britain's very excited about these. But these, Brian, what are these? They're little aircraft with 70-foot wingspan or something like this, absolutely standard. In the meantime, what's China doing? It is developing a new material which is going to allow the creation of hypersonic versions of this. So is China really stealing everything that the West has to provide? I'm not sure that we are innovating in quite the way that Russia and China are at the moment. And so this whole narrative is false. But it gets worse, because this, I thought, was really just an amazing story. So the UK military, the UK Navy, the Royal Navy, has now ditched, according to The Sun, and it's been reported in all the mainstream press now, the custom of Chinese servants on British warships over spy fears, because The guy that's washing the captain's underwear, Brian, might find out where the ship is going to be deployed, pass that on to Beijing, and so we've got to kick all the Chinese off the ships, and they're going to be replaced with Gurkhas instead.
Yeah, this is incredible and really unpleasant language there, Chinese servants, because these were, in my day, largely people that came from Hong Kong. They worked on board the warships. And if you think of the number of men on board, really huge load of washing clothes, a very important one. And they worked extremely hard and they were extremely well valued. So unpleasant, emotive language. But yes, we've now got into the paranoia of China is the next bad guy. So we're going to get rid of the people who work incredibly hard in order to wash the clothes on board the warships.
And keeping the anti-Chinese propaganda going, despite the fact that China doesn't have a coastline in the Arctic. The NATO here, this was on the 20th and the 21st of October, the chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Bauer, was attending the 10th edition of the Arctic Circle Assembly, and he was just so concerned about China. He said the increased competition and militarization in the Arctic region, especially by Russia and China, is concerning. The melting ice in the Arctic is creating new sea routes that would facilitate the movement of large vessels and shorten navigation times. We cannot be naive and ignore the potentially nefarious intentions of some actors in the region. We must remain vigilant and prepare for the unexpected. This is despite the fact that, in fact, to deal with the ice, Russia is building the world's largest icebreakers
because of ice,
so that they can develop this channel. Yes, it is being used for trade, but NATO wants to persuade us that it's for other reasons as well.
I believe Admiral Bauer, of course, was one of the men who was saying a year ago that the Russians were going to run out of ammunition in Ukraine, and that hasn't happened. So can we trust this man? I'm not sure we can.
No. Well, that's it then.
That is it. We'll end there. A very big thank you for everyone that's joined us today, wherever you are in the world. We're getting some really fascinating emails which show us that people in all sorts of different countries are now tuning into the UK column. And we'll also say we value all of the emails we get, even the challenging ones at the moment, talking about reporting on the highly emotive subject of Israel and Gaza. We are going to continue to do our best, and we hope that people appreciate what we do. Finally, a very big thank you to the Alternative View 13 team, who put together a really excellent event on Sunday just gone. Really interesting talks, but wonderful, wonderful people who were delighted to be together again after the pause following lockdown. So well done to John and Lisa and the rest of the Alternative View team. We'll end there. If you're a subscriber, stay with us. We'll have extra in just a few minutes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.